now that God predestined me to have job titles that nobody understands. Because for 12 years I was an archivist for the Anglican Church of Canada, and I had to explain for 12 years what an archivist was. So an archivist works with historical records. So I was tasked with taking care of the historical records of the Anglican Church in British Columbia and Yukon. And now I am an animator, which I get a lot of jokes about, and that's cool. I have a good sense of humor most of the time. So an animator, what is it? People often think Disney, they think cartoons, which isn't too far off from the truth. How I explain it is, if you think about animation, it's taking something that would be still, a picture that would be still, and causing it to move, giving life to it, bringing it to life, causing it to move along. And so if we think about reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks in the Anglican Church of Canada and in Canadian society at large, my task within the Anglican Church is to keep the conversation moving, keep it going, bring life into it. So for those of you who aren't aware, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada finished its mandate in 2015. And so there are some people in Canada who think, well, that's great, we did that, now everything's fine, we can move along. And my job is to say, but wait, how can we keep this conversation going? Because we know that healing, reconciliation, relationship is a lifetime commitment. So that's my job. I don't work for Disney. So I start with what's called a territorial acknowledgement. And so here I would like to say that I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the traditional and unceded territories of the ACOC and the Mi'kmaq. And I do this for several reasons. One reason is that I like to remind us that the people of God were here before settlers ever set foot on this land. The people of God were here. My favorite, or one of my favorite Indigenous authors named Chelsea Vowell says that territorial acknowledgements are sites of potential disruption. And I really like that, because it disrupts our notion of Indigenous invisibility, for example. Now I'm going to say some things that won't make sense in Newfoundland, because what I'm learning here, things are not quite the same as the rest of Canada. Things are different here. So some of this you might not be able to relate to, but in a lot of places in Canada, this is how it feels. So there are a lot of us. I grew up in Manitoba. I'll tell you more about that in a moment, whether you like it or not. I grew up in Manitoba, and Indigenous folks were on reserve. So they were over there. They went to school there. They were over there. We didn't really intermingle with them very much. I was sometimes on the school bus with a Métis girl, but they didn't really exist for me. They stopped being in my history textbook right around Confederation. I knew that kind of early settlers had got together in terms of war and resources. There were partnerships, there were treaties, but then Indigenous people kind of disappeared from my history books. So when we say we are on traditional territory of, fill in the blank, in this place, the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, we're saying Indigenous people are still here. They're still here, and they have a culture and language which is still in existence. So it disrupts these notions. It disrupts the notion that Christ or God arrived with the missionaries. There are so many stories of ways that Christ was here in the lives and hearts and faces of the people who were here. I was in the Nass Valley with the Niska not too long ago. They have a modern treaty, which is quite unheard of, and one of the only treaties in British Columbia. And they told me a story of their Noah's Ark flood story. They have a flood story. They believe in the story of the biblical flood because God came to some of the elders and told them there was a flood coming. And they built a canoe, and sure enough, they were raised up, and there's markings on the top of the mountain that nobody could hike to, but they know they're there through oral history, and they're there because of the flood. And through these things, we know God's people were here. Christ was in the faces and hearts of people here. So these are things to think about when we're on land and amongst people who have been here since time immemorial. So, a bit about myself. This is something that elders have taught me. They said, look, we don't really care that much about what you do. We care about who you are. I always feel weird talking about myself, but they say, speak from your heart, because that's when you get to connect with people. So here we are, first generation settler Canadian of Belgian descent. I'm sometimes asked if I'm in this role because I am Indigenous. I am quite possibly the whitest person in Canada. I do not have Indigenous heritage myself. I'm adopted into 3 different Indigenous families, one in Ontario, one in Manitoba, and one in British Columbia. But I, myself, do not have Indigenous heritage. I worked for the Anglican Church in BC and Yukon as the archivist, as I said, for 12 years. In that time, I had a personal, professional, spiritual transformation, which I'll tell you a bit more about. In 2015, I was adopted into the Grizzly Clan, and in 2017, I was appointed and commissioned by Primate Fred Hiltz to be the reconciliation animator for the Anglican Church of Canada. So that little dot or star is where I grew up in Manitoba. I put a picture of myself on my tricycle. I'm about 3 or 4 years old there. Because the other thing you should know about me is that my name is Melanie, and I'm a recovering racist. So I grew up in Manitoba in a very racist context. And I was taught things about Indigenous people that I now know not to be true. I now know not to be true, and that's where that transformation comes from in my life. And God is good. I'll try that again. God is good all the time, all the time.
Good.
I love it, thank you. But that was about the age that I was when I first heard my parents use a racial slur. A racial slur against Indigenous people. So that's what I grew up with. And I took all of that in. It was very much a part of who I was. The photo with the books and everything, that's the reading room in the archives where I spent hundreds of hours. The photo down on the right is my clan father, Coyote, Terry Alec. He was one of the first survivors of the residential school in Canada to take legal action against the government of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada. So some of you may remember the fact that the Diocese of Caribou ceased its operations because of residential school litigation. It was my clan father. It was my clan father. So what does reconciliation look like? My clan father could not be in a room with a white person 15 years ago without either being triggered, having a meltdown, being very angry. And I grew up hearing racial slurs about Indigenous people. Here we are in our family. That's what God is doing in our lives. And the photo in the top right is Primate Fred Hiltz commissioning me to do this work. So what do I actually do? Great question that nobody asked. So my role has many different aspects, but kind of can be broken down into these 4. So, creating and encouraging reconciliation contacts, teams, initiatives across the Anglican Church of Canada. So doing things like this and raising up people who are able and willing to start making these connections, start to do this work in dioceses across Canada. It's also my task to monitor our church's responses to the TRC 94 calls to action. So when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission completed its work, it wrote a billion-page report, give or take a few pages, and part of that were 94 calls to action. And I love that phrase, because they're not recommendations, because I know as an archivist that recommendations end up in the archives. Calls to action are things that call us to do something. And so I love that they decided to call them calls to action. So I do that at a national level for the most part, but also help people at the diocese, at the parish level, look at how they can live into the 94 calls to action. And the point person for receiving and responding to calls for solidarity and justice from Indigenous communities. So in some places where Indigenous communities and their rights are being infringed upon, either by industry or government, sometimes they will ask us to come alongside them. And so I'm the point person. I don't make the decisions, but I gather the people together in the room to have a conversation about how can we be in partnership, how can we advocate, how can we be of support. And finally, creating educational opportunities for the church to engage on subjects pertaining to the historical and ongoing effects of colonization. So that's part of what we're doing this evening. And one of the things that I usually say when I'm speaking to groups like this is when I talk to a lot of people, they say, that was really bad. What happened was really, really bad. It's in the past, so that's great. Sure, the residential school story is in the past, but the effects of colonization are with us to this day. Maclean's magazine did a feature article in 2016, I believe, where they talked about the prison system being the new residential school system. So the ways that Indigenous people are discriminated against all along the way, from the time that they're young, so that they're in poverty, so that they don't have proper health care, don't have proper supports. All of these things lead people to do and act and have no opportunity in some places, and lead to a place where they may end up in the justice system. And then they're discriminated against. They can't pay bail in some cases. And so they end up going to jail for things, they may go to jail for years, waiting for a trial, haven't even been convicted yet. So these are the kinds of things that are happening in our country that continue the systems of oppression and colonization. And that's just one example. The child welfare system, the health system are all discriminatory against Indigenous people. So that's part of what I do, is helping people to understand we can't do anything about the past. We absolutely cannot, but we can do something about what's happening today. I always do a content warning because I don't know who's going to be in the room. Sometimes there are survivors in the room. Sometimes there are intergenerational survivors in the room. And even folks who have never heard of the residential school system can be really impacted by some of the things that I'm going to tell you. So I just want to let you know that I talk about racism, I talk about abuse in the residential school system, I talk about residential schools. I do show some photos of children, which can be triggering for some people. And if there is something that is upsetting to you, and you need to take a break, please take a break. I've had archbishops, metropolitans walk out. I won't be offended. I won't be offended at all. And if there's something that's kind of bothering you later, please reach out to somebody, whether it's the clergy. I can give out my card as well. Just take care of yourself. Some of these things can be very hard. So in Canada, I always want to bring us at least to a base level. So if some of this you already know, just bear with me. We're going somewhere, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same level of knowledge about certain things. So from the 1850s to 1996, Canadian First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children were removed from their families and put in government-funded and church-administered Indian residential schools, as they were called. Some of them were called Eskimo residential schools in the north, or Eskimo hostels a lot of times. But they were from 1850s to 1996. And there's all kinds of things questions that I get, like were they really forcibly removed? Was it really forceful? I have seen arrest warrants in the archives for parents who did not bring their children to school. So it was definitely forcible. There are places where, and this is where things get complicated. Again, I grew up in a fundamentalist church, so I really like things to be black and white. I really want them to be good or bad, right or wrong. And all of these things are complicated. So there are places in BC and other places where this happened, where Indigenous leadership asked the church to come and set up a school. That's a true thing. What they did not ask for was that their children would not be able to speak their language, that they wouldn't be able to practice sacred ceremony, that they would be abused. Loss of language and culture is rampant throughout Indigenous communities in Canada. There was sterilization and experimentation on children in residential schools. Physical and sexual abuse were common, very common in residential school. There was death by disease, neglect, and exposure for runaway children. So disease was huge. Of course, disease was rampant in all of Canada, but if you bring a lot of children together and house them in a place and don't let them be quarantined, and in some places, Indigenous children were not allowed in hospitals. So they would get sick, and there might be an infirmary. In some places, there were sanatoriums, you know what I mean, that they could go to. There were quote-unquote Indian hospitals in some places, but often they weren't allowed in white hospitals. So a lot of children died because they didn't receive the care that they needed. We now know, and this is the last 10 years or so, we know that the Government of Canada also ran nutritional experiments on children in the school. So they withheld nutrients from some and gave them to some and tracked what happened. And that happened with dentistry, it happened with food, it happened with vitamins and minerals. These are things that I should speak for myself, I just didn't think were possible in this country. I didn't think it was possible. So this is one example of a photo from All Hallows Yale. And All Hallows Yale was an experiment in and of itself. Yale is in the Fraser Canyon of BC. Because it was one of the only schools where they decided to experiment and put white and Indigenous girls together. Now, when they said together, they meant just on the same property. They were in separate dormitories. The Indigenous girls had to get up 2 hours earlier to cook and clean, so that when the white girls got up, they would have breakfast and a clean kitchen, clean washrooms. The Indigenous girls, as you can see, are all in black pinafores, and the white girls wore white pinafores. And they were never photographed. I've never seen a photograph of all of them together. There are school pictures of the white girls, and then there are school pictures of the Indigenous girls like this. So this is from a missionary report that was sent to the Church of England to say, this is the great work that we are doing in the colonies. And the archives were full of reports like this, asking for funding, asking for help, asking for missionaries to come and help in these schools. This is a very famous photo. You may have seen it. This is Thomas More, surely not his Indigenous name, before and after his entrance into Regina Indian Residential School. And this was touted as the success of the colonial project. Before, you see his long braids, you see his traditional dress, and again, his hair is cut off and he's in kind of European dress. And this was, again, sent back to England as a great success story. This is what we're doing. So again, the goals of the residential school system are complicated and in some ways very simple. For the church, it was about conversion and education. So converting the savages goes on and on, that chorus goes on. And we were partners with the Government of Canada in education and in assimilation. So for the state, we had the railway going through Canada, we need to open up the prairies, there's resources on the West Coast, there's resources everywhere. How do we get to these resources when Indigenous people are in the way? We put them in reserves, hope that they will die of starvation. When they don't, we take away their children. It was seen as a solution to what was called the Indian problem. These are hard things. These are hard things to hear and to accept. To be honest with you, and this is a place where I feel safe, I did not do well in the archives learning these things. So as I said, I grew up with racist beliefs. I believed, as my parents had taught me, that Indians were drunks. They didn't pay taxes. They were sitting on land that they didn't take care of. There was all kinds of myths that were part of my upbringing. And when I began to see the photographs, when I began to hear the audio recordings, when I saw the film, when I read the correspondence between the bishops and the Indian agent, and I thought, well, maybe it was just the Government of Canada that was bad. Maybe it wasn't the church that was that bad. But when I read the correspondence, when I saw the photographs, we were equal partners in this venture, and that's a hard thing to swallow. I converted to Anglicanism. I was confirmed in 2010. I'm a proud Canadian. I love this country. I love being Canadian. And I could not figure out how to reconcile in my heart and my mind how this country that I love could have done this, how this church that I converted into could have done this. And I broke down. I broke down. And God did a beautiful thing. God completely broke me. I had a Damascus Road meltdown, an epic, 5-alarm meltdown. I was hospitalized for about 5 weeks during that time. I was not doing well. I heard hundreds of stories of survivors. One of the anomalies of the archives in Vancouver is that when most residential schools closed, the records of the school went to Ottawa, to the Government Library and Archives Canada. When St. George's Lytton, which is again in the Fraser Canyon, when that school closed, the student records were sent to the church archives. Nobody knows why, it just happened. And so we were the only faith archives in Canada that we know of that had a full set of residential school records. And there I was, quite possibly the whitest, most racist person in Canada, tasked with helping survivors of residential schools access their records. Wow, God did a number on me. And it was amazing. I am so grateful. I'm so grateful that I am not the person that I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I would not have Coyote as my father. I would not have sisters and my cousins. I would not be the person that I believe God is calling me to be if it weren't for that. And so I say these things to say these things are hard to hear. They're hard to take in. But I don't want to leave us in guilt and shame. I remember somebody early on, I was still an archivist at the time, and I did a talk on the residential school system and what the church response could be to this. And somebody said to me, "Why are you here to make us feel bad? Why are you here to make us feel guilty?" And I thought, oh, I've failed. I've failed here. My role is not to make people feel ashamed. My desire, my hope is not to make people feel guilty or ashamed. My hope is to bring us to a sense of understanding and then a place where we feel inspired to go out and live the life that Christ is calling us to as the family, as the body of Christ. Anglican residential schools, just really brief overview. There were 35, give or take, schools in total. The estimated number of children varies from 150,000. We know there were many more. When Indian agents or the RCMP went to take children, often they had to go to remote places. So school age was starting at 6, but if you have a 4-year-old there, you don't want to have to come back next year and grab them, so you take the 4-year-old as well. So you have kids that are not registered, so they're not in the official records, but you know that they're there because they've been taken against policy. So there are many more, and there were some schools that were not recognized by the Government of Canada. The number of children increases when we look at the day scholars, and you may be aware of this. This is a new piece of information and litigation that's happening. The day scholars were children who attended residential schools, but the dorm was full, so they were boarded with white families or were boarded with the minister. But they were left out of the residential schools agreement because the government said, well, you didn't stay the night, so you're not actually residential school survivors. But we know that language loss, culture loss, abuse, those aren't just things that happen in dorms. That happens as part of a system. And so this is a new development where these folks are being recognized. And day schools is another place where this kind of thing happened. This was, again, a partnership between the church and the Government of Canada. And these were schools often located on reserve. So children still stayed within their family groups, but again, were not allowed to speak their language. Hair was often cut off. So depending on what we define as a residential school, the number fluctuates. So in 2006, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement was signed by the Government of Canada, church entities which ran residential schools, so Anglican, United, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, and the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit, Tapiriit, Kanatami. And this was in response to class action lawsuits. So the government realized, oh boy, we're losing in these lawsuits. And if we have 80,000 survivors alive at the time, what are we going to do? So came together to create this. So each diocese in the Anglican Church of Canada is actually a signatory to the agreement. And so what's interesting is sometimes I go to dioceses and they say, well, we didn't have a residential school, so this really isn't our issue. And I say, we're all signatories. And beyond that, we're all Canadians. We're all the body of Christ. So whether we're involved in a system or not, we are part of this body. We are part of this history. This belongs to all of us. So here we are today, 22 years since the last Indian residential school closed. It was 1996. It was Gordon's residential school in Saskatchewan, and it was an Anglican school. 1996, I could have gone to residential school. I think I might be one of the younger people here. So if we had been Indigenous, we might have all gone to residential school. So it's not ancient history either. We're 4 years post-TRC and 2 years since Canada endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is a UN document that was written by worldwide Indigenous folks, and it's set as the minimum standard for the survival of Indigenous people. The minimum standard. Canada was one of 4 votes against this document. It went to vote in 2010. There were 126 yeses and 4 noes, and the 4 noes were Canada, United States, New Zealand, and Australia. So the 4 biggest colonies, although don't tell Americans that I just called them a colony, but 4 of the biggest colonies that had the largest Indigenous population were the 4 that said, it sounds great, but we can't really do it. And Canada was one of those countries. And it wasn't until 2 years ago that under the current government, the objector status, as it was called, was removed. But it has not been implemented. So tomorrow, in the Senate, Bill C-262 will be having its final vote. And Bill C-262 is a bill that went through Parliament. It was a private member's bill. Romeo Saganash brought it before Parliament to say we need to implement the UN Declaration. If this is the minimum standard for Indigenous survival, we have to implement this. And so he put forward a bill. It was a private member's bill, so everyone said it has a snowball's chance in hell. It passed 3 readings in Parliament. It's now before the Senate. If it is not voted on tomorrow, it likely will fail after 2.5 years of work. So, if you are a person who prays, please pray for our Senate tomorrow as they look at this bill, the minimum standard for survival of Indigenous people. So, what's happening in the Anglican Church now? Right now, there are 3 commissions that are looking at different aspects of reconciliation. The Primate's Commission on Discovery, Reconciliation, and Justice was the first, and this was commissioned by Primate Fred Hiltz. And this was the beginning of us trying to live into what it means to be a church that is made up of reconciling people. And so this is a commission made up of Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks working together to create a plan of action. Where do we go from here? So the fact that my position was created was actually the brainchild of this commission. So it's one of the ways that they saw us needing a staff person to begin to get this work moving, a full-time staff person to look at ways that we can do this, to create opportunities for education and action. The Vision Keepers were commissioned at General Synod in 2013, 16? It'll come to me. They are all Indigenous, elders and youth. It's an elders and youth council. And they help to guide our work. They kind of have, between them, they kind of span the country, urban and rural, young and elderlier, that's not a word, elders, to say, here's what we see happening. Here are the gaps that need to be filled. Here are the things that I see in our church that are problematic or that are oppressive. Here are the ways that the church is still acting in a way that is not helpful. The Jubilee Commission is the 3rd one, and this is the newest one. It just had its first meeting a couple months ago, and the Jubilee Commission is looking at ways that we can support, encourage, and fund the Indigenous self-determining church within the Anglican Church of Canada. There's a movement of Indigenous Anglicans, some of the most faithful Anglicans I've ever met, coming together to say, how do we as Indigenous people be church in the world? And how can the rest of the church support that mission in Indigenous communities, being Christ to the world in Indigenous communities in an Indigenous way? So I support all 3 of these commissions as their staff support. So no rest for the wicked. So what are we doing? One of the things that the TRC called us to do was to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, which when I first started this work, I had to look up repudiate in the dictionary. I don't know about you. I did a degree in English, and I did not know what repudiate means. But it means kind of to take back, to say, ooh, that wasn't, that wasn't good. It's probably more sophisticated than that, but that's how I think about it in my mind. To say this was something that guided us for a long time. This no longer has power. This no longer guides us. The doctrine of discovery was a papal bull, and so it actually came out of the church. And it said to explorers who went to the New World, when you get there, you have my permission to take the land. And if there are people there, if they're not Christian, they don't count. So don't worry. So when explorers came to the New World, they found people, but they didn't see Christ in those people. They didn't see that God was at work amongst the people. And they said, well, they're not Christians, so they don't count. So they could take the land. A lot of us, I didn't know this. I didn't know that this has guided us. And there are ways that this still influences the way that Canada, and sometimes the way our church acts. And so we as an Anglican Church of Canada in 2012 repudiated the doctrine of discovery and officially endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to say, if this is the minimum standard, then we need to be committed to this. And that's where the Jubilee Commission, the Vision Keepers, the Primates Commission, they're helping us to look at, okay, we've endorsed this, but what does it mean to live it out in the world? There was a consultation in September of 2017 in Pinawa, Manitoba, which was called The Road to Warm Springs. And in one of the Indigenous translations of the Bible, the Road to Emmaus story is called The Road to Warm Springs. And it was based on that. Indigenous and non-Indigenous Anglicans coming together to say, what is this? How do we live into this together? And as I talked about, the movement of self-determination within the Anglican Church of Canada is where we are trying to live out this commitment to the UN Declaration and to the 94 calls to action. I'm not going to go as in detail into these as I might have because I like the conversation at the end. So, there are 94 calls to action. There are some that are directed to the churches in particular because we had a particular involvement in the schools. There are some that are directed to all of the settlement parties, as they're called, so all of the church representatives, the Government of Canada, and the INOs, as they're called, Indigenous National Organizations. And there are some that are directed to others. But I believe that we as the Anglican Church have a prophetic voice, a role as a prophetic voice. So the calls to action to others are to Government of Canada, to the business sector, to the media sector. And I believe very strongly that we can be the prophetic voice to call others into this work. So what the man in the robes is, what's his name again? John. No, I'm kidding. What John is handing out is actually a resource that was ecumenically produced by all the churches that were involved in the residential school system and beyond. And it is a little booklet that includes all 94 calls to action and all the articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there's a foreword by our National Indigenous Bishop, Mark McDonald, and also some questions. So if you would like to study together or look at it together, there are ways to kind of engage with it at a deeper level. I'm going straight to the grassroots. So there are things that we are doing as a national church to advocate, to live out our commitment. So I go to Ottawa and sit down with Indigenous Northern Affairs, Crown Indigenous Relations, and we talk about ways that we can work together. I encourage them to live out their commitment to the settlement agreement. Bill C-262, we've been very active. So there are things that are happening at the national level that are really exciting. The Anglican Healing Fund is a fund that predated the settlement agreement, started in 1993, around the time of Primate Michael Pear's apology. And the Anglican Healing Fund, over the years, has given $8 million plus to Indigenous-led healing initiatives. And so this is really key because It's not about non-Indigenous people saying, I know what you need. This is what you need, because we tried that and it went really badly. So this is about Indigenous people saying, this is what we need to heal. Can you help us? Yes. And this is how we're able to do it. It's really exciting. It's really exciting. I've been honored enough to go to some of the communities who have done language classes, who have set up healing lodges for youth and elders to come together and have traditional teachings. It's a beautiful thing and something that our church can be very proud of. There are workshops that we've done. The Anglican Foundation has been very active. I know that this diocese has a special heart for the Primates World Relief and Development Fund, which has been very active in partnership with the community of Piganjicum in Northern Ontario to bring clean water, sanitation for the first time to that community. So all of a sudden, a 92-year-old who used to have to walk down to the pump or to the lake to get water has running water in her house for the first time. That changes something. There are some people who feel that we as churches should not be involved in these kinds of projects because that brings the government of Canada off the hook. It takes them off the hook because they're supposed to be doing that. I'm of the opinion that if you can help someone, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Yes, we can do both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We can pressure the government and we can do what we can. So there are national things that are happening that are very exciting. But what really gets me going in a good way, what gets me excited, what gives me hope, is what happens at the grassroots, what happens on the ground. One of my mentors, the Reverend Ray Aldred, I think he finished his thesis. The Reverend Dr. Ray Aldred, he is the Indigenous Ministries the Director of Indigenous Ministries at the Vancouver School of Theology. And he said to me once, reconciliation must have a location. And then he walked away. And I'm trying to get used to this thing. Often an elder or a teacher in Indigenous communities will say something and then kind of walk away. And I think of Jesus and his parables, because he wasn't super great at explaining things either sometimes. And so he said, reconciliation must have a location. And I thought about that, and I thought, I don't know what this means. And over the course of my travels and visits to Indigenous communities, it's become a lot clearer, is that it happens on the ground. It has to have a location, it has to have feet on the ground, happens in relationship. What happens at the national level is amazing and needs to happen. What happens at the diocesan level is amazing and needs to happen. What happens in relationship between two people or between two communities is where God shows up and the sacred and the secular overlap and disappear. And all of a sudden we're in relationship with one another. So here are some of the things that I've seen across Canada. In Sechelt, there is a drum circle. And the Anglican Church there approached an Indigenous community and asked if they would be willing to share teachings with them. And this is really exciting for me because in some places, the church waits for Indigenous people to come through the doors. And something really amazing happens in my experience when church people leave the doors and go to the community. Indigenous people are forced to live in white culture, in dominant culture all the time. All the time, every day they are forced to live in our culture. We are never, to my knowledge, forced to live in Indigenous culture. So when someone goes to an Indigenous community and says, you live in a colonial culture, in the dominant culture all the time. I don't know anything about your culture. Is there something that you can teach me? Can I learn from you? And that happened. And so in the Sechelt Nation, now there's a group of Sechelt folk who taught Anglicans how to drum, and then taught them how to make their own drums, and taught them some songs. And when they sat over a meal, this is often where it happens, and talked about the songs and the meaning of the songs. And one of the teachers, the Sechelt teachers, talked about one song and how it was about creation, and the this has to do with the bear, and this has to do with the wolf, this has to do with the raven. And somebody said, oh, and the frogs too, because the frogs are quite small. And one of the Anglicans said, oh, that sounds like all creatures great and small. And all of a sudden we're speaking the same language, and we're thanking the same Creator for giving us the big and the small. All of a sudden these bridges are being built, and understanding comes to light. Feasts. This is amazing. This is a story that Bishop Mark MacDonald, our National Indigenous Bishop, I keep saying that, you know who he is. Bishop Mark told me about a story when he was on the White Earth Reserve, I think it was. And he told me this story about how he was there, and it was on a reserve, and so it was Indigenous folk that he was ministering to and with. And he called a parish council meeting, and he said, everybody be there, it's at 6:30. One of the wardens said, will there be dinner? And Bishop Mark said, no, there's no dinner, but come after dinner. And so Bishop Mark showed up, and nobody showed up. Nobody showed up, not even the wardens. Nobody showed up. So he saw the warden a couple days later, and he said, we had a parish council meeting. You're a warden of the church. Where were you? And the warden said, you said there was no food, so we knew it wasn't important. I learned something from that story. Food in Indigenous cultures, most I would say, is incredibly important. Teachings happen over meals. Fellowship happens over meals. Meals can take a very long time in some Indigenous communities. Meals also connect to the Creator, because in many traditional communities where hunting, fishing is still the way of sustenance, and again, colonization has destroyed a lot of those links, but where that still happens, you connect to the earth, to the Creator, to the creation. You know where your food comes from. And so in these teachings, in these gatherings, this is where communication happens, teaching happens, bonds are built. So one parish wasn't sure what they were going to do in terms of reconciliation, but they knew there were a lot of residential school survivors in their midst. And so they decided to put on a feast for residential school survivors, where the church folk would cook and they would serve and they would put on this feast. And in the end, everyone dined together. It was a beautiful thing. Educational exhibits. St. James Cathedral in Toronto has an educational exhibit that travels, and you can request it. So you can request that it be sent to you. It's a large display, timeline and photos, kind of looking at the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous folk over the years. It's really amazing. You can contact St. James Cathedral for that in Toronto. Water project I've talked about with PWRDF. The little booklets that you have, I know I'm an archivist. I still think of them as the Women's Auxiliary. I know they're the Anglican Church Women. So the ACW, there's an ACW group that has a knitting group. They do bassinets for newborn children. And they've decided that while they are knitting, they take turns reading from that booklet. They take turns reading aloud the 94 calls to action and the UN Declaration. And they're learning things. And they are outraged. And they are excited about getting involved in changing these things. So these are little things. It doesn't have to be complicated. These are little things that are a step on the journey. Talking circles. There's a talking circle in the Diocese of Huron, brings together Indigenous and non-Indigenous folk, and they just talk. And I said, well, what do you talk about? And they said, well, we just talk. So I was saying the other day, it could be about the boiler. Somebody's boiler went, and now it's an inconvenience because somebody's boiler went. It can be, how was your day? It can be, what's your favorite movie? And then it turns into deeper things. As people get to understand the day-to-day existence of one another, what makes them tick, they begin to go deeper and deeper. And again, any place where a relationship happens is where reconciliation is happening. Protest solidarity is a dicey one in some places. I said the other day, I am not into chaining myself to anything. I do not want to chain myself to a tree, to a gate. I don't want to chain myself to anything. That is not what God is calling me to. Well, maybe it is. I shouldn't say it out loud. God has not called me to chain myself to anything. However, for some, this is a way that they live into a calling of God. So I have two friends who are clergy. They are priests. They went to their bishop and they said, we have been asked by an Indigenous community to stand in solidarity with them at a certain resource extraction site. We are going to do this. Will you be taking away our license? We're going to do it anyway, but we wanted to let you know, and we wanted to ask if we'll still have licenses after this. The bishop said, if this is what God's calling you to do, do it. So that's what they did. They chained themselves, one to a tree, one to a fence, and they went to jail. They went to prison. They were convicted. They went to prison. And that was their living out because now they are trusted in that community. They are invited to ceremony in that community. They are invited to say prayers at the sacred fire in that community, because that community now trusts them. I really hope I'm not called to that, but it's a possibility. It's a possibility. The Bishop's Ride is another one. I call it, oh man, this is something else. Bishop Rob Hardwick, Diocese of Capel, rode across Canada on his bicycle, oh boy, to raise awareness for the Anglican Healing Fund and for reconciliation. Again, something I really hope I'm never called to, but this was his way of doing this. So I was there when he dipped his bike in the Pacific, and all across the way he stopped in churches and talked about reconciliation. Art installations are something that I feel passionate about. I make things. I wouldn't necessarily call them art, but here we are. I do love art. And there was one community that had a parish hall, and they looked at it and they said, this would look really good with art in it. And they realized that there were Indigenous artists amongst them and in their community. And so they approached 5 Indigenous artists and they said, would you like to be part of a show? And some of these people had never shown their work ever. They'd never been asked to show their work ever. And this community invited local curators, local art dealers, local politicians. They invited everybody to come to the opening of this art show in their parish hall. And now 2 of those Indigenous artists have commissions. And all of a sudden, again, something brought these folks together. They now have a relationship. And this was their parish hall, which they said, we're not using it much. This is something we can do. They had a great reception. It was amazing. Medicine workshops is another thing. A little bit like the drum circle, there's one community that asked an Indigenous community, there's a lot of medicine, traditional medicine in our woods. There's, sage, there's sweetgrass, there's stinging nettles. I have had some rough encounters with some stinging nettles, so when I heard that, I wasn't super keen. But then my clan father, Terry Coyote, made me stinging nettle tea when I was sick. Whew. Wow, that was incredible. It was absolutely incredible. So there was a community that asked another community, can we learn from you? And they went out medicine picking together and had lunch together. And these are simple things that start to create relationship. That is exciting to me. That's really exciting to me. There are a few resolutions going to General Synod in 2019 that I just want to touch on really quickly. There are revisions to Canon 22. Canon 22 is the canon on the National Indigenous Ministry. And this would allow the National Indigenous Bishop and the Sacred Circle, the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, to have more autonomy, to make sure that they can make decisions for themselves. It also gives them an official seat at the table at General Synod. So right now, Anglican Council of Indigenous People have voice but no vote. They have voice but no vote at General Synod. What's that about? So these revisions, which we hope will pass, will cause representatives from the Anglican Council of Indigenous People to have voice and vote. The National Reconciliation Coordinating Committee. For all of our other ministries, we have coordinating committees, which, as we know, committees, I remember being in the archives, and there was a committee on committees in the Diocese of New Westminster. I thought only the Anglican Church could come up with a committee on, well, not the only, but, the Anglican Church is one of the denominations that could come up with a committee on committees. So a committee, here we are. We are hoping to set up a network of reconciliation ambassadors across Canada, and this committee would coordinate that work, would help me so that I don't have to go everywhere. I love going everywhere, but I'm just not capable. But so that we can start to raise up leaders across the country and start to teach them these things, teach them what they need to know to raise up more leaders. Discipleship, that's what it is, discipleship. And the continuation of the Vision Keepers. So the Primates Commission on Discovery, Reconciliation, and Justice will cease its work at General Synod. The Vision Keepers were also supposed to cease their work. Their mandate was supposed to be ending, and we are hoping that they will continue. Again, there's good news. This is a good news story. Many of us are on this journey together. We will make mistakes, and we will survive them. In a lot of places that I go, folks are scared to take that first step, And I get that. I really get that. They're afraid of making things worse, of saying the wrong thing, of offending somebody. There's good news. We may well make mistakes, and we will absolutely survive them. I tell this story when I was the archivist. I single-handedly destroyed the relationship between the Diocese of New Westminster and an Indigenous community that they had been in relationship with for about 128 years. I did an epic cultural fail. It was epic. I am ashamed, I am embarrassed, and I'm still trying to get over it 12 years later. But the fact is that now we're back in relationship. I was able to see what I had done. I was able to go and ask for forgiveness. And our relationship has grown and grown and grown. And now we're better than ever. Now, I'm not saying go out and screw up because it's going to make things better. I don't advise it at all. But don't let that be the thing that stops you from taking that first step. And God is on our side. For real. For real. I know that there are many situations where in war, in colonization, we have said over the years, God's with us on this one. But we know in Corinthians and in other places, God calls us to be people of reconciliation. People of reconciliation. 2 Corinthians 5 talks about we are to be reconcilers. We have been reconciled to God through Jesus, and we are called to do the same in the world. So God is with us in this work, on this journey. I am sad that I am sometimes asked this, but I am. Why should I bother? This is in the past. We're doing fine. Why do we have to do this? And I said, well, you don't have to do this. I'm not going to force you to do it. However, there are some things that may remind us of how we are called to be in the world. Our baptismal vows say this: will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? Will you strive for justice and peace among all peoples and respect the dignity of every human life? And one of the things that I love about being an Anglican is that baptism is not a spectator sport in this church. Because in baptism, when someone else is baptized, we're called to recommit to these things, which I sometimes don't like because I sometimes like to forget things that are hard that I am called to. But thanks be to God, God is constantly calling us back into these baptismal vows. We are called by our Savior in Scripture, and we are healed in the process. Out of psychology and psychiatry, the term a moral wound has been coined. And it came out of seeing soldiers come back from war. And they have been forced to do things that as humans we are not wired, we are not created to be doing. And they bear a moral wound. Sometimes it looks like PTSD. Sometimes it looks like the inability to reconnect with family. Sometimes it looks like the inability to return to quote-unquote normal life. There's a shame, there's a guilt, there's a terror that is carried. Bishop Mark talks about our church's moral wound. We've done things that we weren't wired or called to do. And there's a woundedness to who we are. And I don't always mean personally. And this is the other thing about racism. When I say that we have racist structures in our church, people get angry with me because they take it really personally. They say, I'm not a racist. I say, I'm not calling you a racist. I'm saying there are structures at work. There are systems at work that oppress people. And the moral wound has to do with us healing from that, healing from the damage that's inflicted on everyone who's in a broken relationship. We know that. When a relationship is broken, it's not one party that suffers, it's both. So we are all healed in the process of reconciliation. I am grateful to be with you. I can't tell you. Poor Bishop John, everywhere he goes, he says, I don't know how many people are going to be there. I don't know how many people are going to show up. I think he's a little bit nervous. I think he's a little bit scared that I'm going to walk in and say, this wasn't what I was hoping for. I need to tell you something. I am so glad you showed up. You are the right people. You're the right people to be here tonight. And I am grateful that you are here. I really, really, really am. Something happens when we gather. I really believe that God works in us and through us. Please keep in touch. That's my email address. I don't know if you can see it or not. I have a newsletter, so every month, once a month, I send out a newsletter saying, here's what's happening in the Anglican Church of Canada at the national level in terms of reconciliation. Here are ways that you can get involved. And then I usually try to highlight a reconciliation initiative that's happening somewhere in Canada. So last month it was a partnership between the Musqueam First Nation and Christ Church Cathedral in Vancouver. They got together on a weaving project. And so I just say, hey, here's an idea, here's an inspiration. So if you'd like to keep in touch, please do. On the national website, there is also the Reconciliation Toolkit. And bless Fred Hiltz, he was traveling somewhere. I think he went to Ottawa, and he sat down with a group in Ottawa, and they said, what we'd really like to have is a place where we could go online, where we could learn all this stuff and get resources on these things, all in one place. That would be great. And Fred said, Melanie's working on a reconciliation toolkit. But Fred forgot to tell me that I was working on a reconciliation toolkit. So I started to get emails saying, when's the reconciliation toolkit going to happen? And so I got to work on a reconciliation toolkit. So in this toolkit, there are resources on the history, so learning the history. So if you want to talk to other people about this, if you want to learn more for your own sake, there's stuff on the history. There's stuff on land. Whose land are we on? What's the history of treaties? What are treaties about? How have they been kept? How have they been broken? There are links to resources for Bible study, for worship, for book studies. The Anglican Church of Canada has also just produced a video, a full-length documentary on the doctrine of discovery, which was what I talked a bit about. And it was 2 years in the making. And they purposely, I just came in at the end, but they purposely made it accessible to church and non-church folk. And they have National Chief Perry Bellegarde in it. Senator Murray Sinclair is in it. The president of the Inuit Teperit Kanatami, Natano Bed, is in it. So they got really big name people to be part of this, which is hard to do. But these are people who have come to trust us along the way. So this documentary was released in March to rave reviews. The Assembly of First Nations were thrilled. It's being used in churches across Canada. It's being used in universities. I was at McGill University doing a talk at the Montreal Diocesan College, and I walked by a bulletin board and I saw an advertisement that McGill was showing this Doctrine of Discovery film made by the Anglican Church of Canada, and they were having a discussion afterwards. Blew my mind. There's a study guide as well. So it's all there, all that education. And then if you want to take action, if there are things that you want to do, there are some Indigenous organizations who are looking for volunteers, they're looking for partners, looking for folks to get involved. So there's a bunch of stuff there that can be helpful. So thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for being God's people here tonight. And I am open to questions. I am open to comments. I'll stay around. If you need more booklets, let me know. I have more, and I would rather not travel home with them. So thank you so much for having me.